Very urgent. Your soulmate needs to explain what happened this afternoon. Something interrupted the ordinary rhythm of this afternoon, and your soulmate has been replaying one particular moment ever since. It happened so quickly that, at first, they almost convinced themselves it meant nothing. A familiar room. Afternoon light stretching across the floor. A phone resting face down on the table. Then someone across from them casually mentioned you. Your soulmate froze. Not dramatically, but enough that the person speaking noticed. Because what was said next connected two details your soulmate had never connected before. Suddenly, an old conversation made sense. A silence they had misunderstood made sense. Even something you once said, something they had nearly forgotten, returned with completely different meaning. They reached for their phone and almost contacted you immediately. Almost. Their thumb hovered over your name before they pulled their hand away. They knew this wasn't something they could explain with a rushed sentence. There was too much underneath it. And here's the detail that matters: whatever happened this afternoon didn't push their thoughts away from you. It pulled everything toward you. Every unfinished conversation. Every question they had avoided asking themselves. Every feeling they had tried to keep neatly contained. Stay close to this moment, because the reason they stopped themselves from contacting you is not what you might expect. A few minutes later, your soulmate stepped away from everyone else and found somewhere quiet. The sounds around them faded behind a closed door while they stared through a window, barely noticing what was outside. Their expression had changed. Not because they had received terrible news, but because they had finally understood something about their own behavior. They had spent so much time waiting for certainty that they hadn't realized what their hesitation might look like from your side. Distance could look like indifference. Silence could look like forgetting. Caution could easily be mistaken for a lack of feeling. And that realization landed harder than anything anyone had actually said. They whispered something under their breath: "They probably have no idea." That sentence became the turning point. Because this afternoon wasn't really about another person revealing some enormous secret. It was about one small observation forcing your soulmate to see the situation through your eyes. They remembered the moments when they wanted to say more but chose safer words. The times they opened a message, typed several lines, erased them, and sent something ordinary instead. The moments when they hoped you would somehow understand what they themselves were afraid to explain. But one unanswered question remained. Why had today's conversation suddenly made them unwilling to keep doing that? The answer began appearing when they picked up their phone again. This time, they didn't open your conversation immediately. They opened an older memory first, something connected to an afternoon when the two of you had shared a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. Maybe it was a sentence. Maybe it was the way you looked at them. Maybe it was something you did without realizing how deeply they remembered it. Your soulmate had always interpreted that memory one way, until today gave them another possibility. Their eyes stayed fixed on the screen as the pieces quietly aligned. Then came the expression nobody else in the room understood, a small, almost disbelieving smile followed by a long silence. Because they suddenly wondered whether they had been waiting for reassurance that you had already given them. And if that was true, then they had spent far too long protecting themselves from a question that might already have an answer. They began typing again. This time, they didn't erase the first sentence. They added another. Then another. But before sending anything, they stopped at one specific line, a line that explained exactly what happened this afternoon and why it changed the way they see you. And when they read that sentence back to themselves, they realized there was still one person they needed to speak with before you could receive the full truth. The person your soulmate needed to speak with was someone who had quietly witnessed more than they realized. Not someone trying to interfere. Not someone carrying gossip. This was someone who had watched your soulmate mention you and then immediately change the subject, watched their expression soften whenever your name appeared, and noticed how differently they behaved whenever a conversation came close to what they truly felt. Your soulmate found them later that afternoon and asked a question that sounded simple: "Do you think I waited too long?" For several seconds, there was no answer. The room seemed unusually still. Then the person looked directly at them and said, "I think you've been trying so hard to say the perfect thing that you forgot they can't hear what you never say." Your soulmate looked down. That sentence landed exactly where it needed to. And then came another detail, one they hadn't expected. The person reminded them of a conversation from weeks earlier, when your soulmate had defended you without hesitation after someone misunderstood something about you. They had spoken with certainty then. No rehearsing. No hesitation. No searching for safer words. "You already know how you feel," the person told them. "You're just afraid of what happens after you admit it." Your soulmate didn't argue. They couldn't. Because suddenly, what happened this afternoon had become much bigger than one conversation. It had exposed a pattern. And if you're wondering what they finally admitted next, stay with this, because their answer changed the direction of everything. Your soulmate leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment before saying something they had apparently never said aloud: "I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid that I waited so long they won't believe me anymore." There it was. The real explanation. Their silence had never meant there was nothing to say. In their mind, it had become increasingly difficult to explain everything without sounding as though they were arriving too late. They remembered every opportunity they had allowed to pass because they thought another would come. Another evening. Another conversation. Another perfect opening. But this afternoon made them realize that relationships don't move according to perfect timing. People change. Lives move forward. Feelings need communication, not assumptions. Your soulmate looked again at the unfinished message on their phone, and this time their expression wasn't uncertain. It was focused. They started rewriting. Not to make the message more impressive, but to make it more truthful. They removed the clever opening. Deleted the carefully polished explanation. What remained was simpler: what happened today made them realize they owed you honesty. And there was something else they wanted to explain, something connected to why they had seemed distant at exactly the moments when they actually wanted to move closer. If this story feels meaningful to you, you're welcome to share it with someone who might connect with it. Leave your thoughts in the comments, or subscribe and stay around for what comes next. Because the message your soulmate was writing still contained one line they weren't sure they had the courage to send. Then the afternoon shifted again. Their phone lit up before they could finish. Your soulmate glanced down, expecting something ordinary, but the notification made them sit completely still. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was something far more personal, a reminder connected to you, arriving at almost the exact moment they had decided to stop hiding behind hesitation. Maybe it was an old photo resurfacing. Maybe a calendar reminder. Maybe a saved note containing something you once said. Whatever appeared, it brought back one specific memory with startling clarity. The moment your soulmate first realized you mattered differently. They remembered where they were standing. They remembered your expression. They remembered pretending the moment hadn't affected them nearly as much as it had. And suddenly, the unfinished message in front of them wasn't about explaining only this afternoon anymore. It was about explaining everything that had led to it. Your soulmate began writing faster, finally allowing sentences they had repeatedly erased in the past to remain on the screen. They admitted why they pulled back. They admitted what they misunderstood. They admitted that today's conversation forced them to reconsider an assumption they had carried for far too long. Then they reached the final line. Their finger hovered over send. 1 second passed. Then another. But just before touching the screen, they received a second notification. And this one contained your name. Your soulmate's eyes widened, because the timing seemed almost impossible. They opened it, read what appeared, and immediately realized the message they had just written could no longer end the way they originally planned. Your name on that screen instantly changed the atmosphere, but what your soulmate saw wasn't the confession, question, or dramatic message they might have imagined. It was something smaller, and somehow that made it more powerful. A notification had surfaced, an interaction connected to you, something ordinary enough that anyone else would have dismissed it within seconds, yet it reminded your soulmate that while they had been privately analyzing every emotion, your life had continued moving. You weren't standing still inside their uncertainty. You had your own days, decisions, conversations, hopes, and unanswered questions. Your soulmate stared at the screen, then slowly looked back at the message they had been preparing. Suddenly, several sentences felt wrong. They sounded too focused on explaining themselves and not enough on understanding what their silence may have communicated to you. So they deleted an entire paragraph. Then another. What remained was vulnerable in a completely different way. I need to explain what happened this afternoon, but first I need to acknowledge something. I may have expected you to understand things I never clearly told you. They read that line twice. This was no longer about finding the perfect words. It was about finally taking responsibility for the distance between intention and communication. But don't move past this detail too quickly, because the next thing they remembered revealed why this afternoon had affected them so deeply in the first place. Someone earlier had asked your soulmate one direct question about you. And they had answered before they had time to protect themselves. The question had been almost casual: if you could talk to them right now without worrying about the outcome, what would you actually say? Your soulmate hadn't prepared for it. There was no time to construct a polished response or hide behind uncertainty. And the first words out of their mouth surprised even them: I'd tell them they mattered the whole time. Silence followed. Your soulmate looked away as if hearing their own sentence from someone else's voice. That was the moment everything this afternoon had really turned. Because underneath all the complicated explanations was an uncomplicated truth. They had been measuring their feelings by how safely they could express them instead of by how consistently those feelings remained. Memories started returning differently now. The conversation where they wanted you to stay longer. The day they noticed a tiny change in your mood before anyone else did. The time something reminded them of you and they almost reached for their phone. None of those moments alone proved what the future should become, and your soulmate understood that. They couldn't decide your feelings for you. They couldn't assume you were waiting. They couldn't rewrite whatever had happened between you. But they could finally stop pretending their own feelings were impossible to name. And that distinction gave them an unexpected calm. The urgency wasn't about forcing an outcome. It was about telling the truth while there was still an opportunity for an honest conversation. So they returned to the message and added one sentence they had previously been afraid to write: "I don't expect anything from you after I explain this. I just don't want silence to keep speaking for me." Then came the moment your soulmate had been avoiding all afternoon. Instead of pressing send, they placed the phone on the table and walked toward the window again, because one final question remained: should something this important really arrive as text on a screen? Their reflection stared back through the glass while afternoon light slowly began giving way to evening. They imagined you reading a long message without hearing their voice, without seeing their expression, without being able to ask what they meant in the moment. That didn't feel right anymore. Your soulmate picked up the phone, highlighted nearly everything they had written, and saved it instead of sending it. For the first time that day, they smiled, not because the situation had magically resolved itself, but because they finally knew what they wanted to do. They wanted a real conversation. No carefully edited paragraphs. No mysterious hints. No expecting you to decode what they couldn't say directly. They wanted to explain exactly what was said this afternoon, why it brought an old memory back, and why that memory changed their understanding of the connection between you. But there was still a missing piece. Before making that call or sending that first simple message, your soulmate returned to the person who had started this entire chain of realization and asked, "When you mentioned them earlier, there was something you almost told me. What was it?" The person's expression changed immediately. They hesitated, glanced toward the doorway, and then answered with a sentence your soulmate absolutely had not expected, and suddenly, the afternoon had one more secret left to reveal. The answer arrived quietly, almost too quietly for something that would completely rearrange your soulmate's understanding of the afternoon. The person near the doorway held their gaze for a moment and finally said, "I almost told you that every time you talk about them, you describe what you're afraid of losing before you ever describe what you're afraid of saying." Your soulmate didn't respond. Their eyes dropped toward the phone in their hand as the meaning settled in. That was the missing piece. All afternoon, they had believed the turning point was discovering something about you, but now they understood that the real discovery was about themselves. They had been searching for external proof when their own reactions had been revealing the truth for months. The person continued gently, reminding them of little moments they had witnessed. How your soulmate remembered details from conversations with you that everyone else had forgotten, how they became unusually thoughtful whenever someone asked where things stood between you, how they could speak confidently about almost anything until the subject became what they actually wanted from this connection. Then came the sentence that stopped them cold: maybe you don't need another sign. Maybe you need an honest conversation. Your soulmate looked toward the fading afternoon light and finally laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because the answer suddenly seemed so much simpler than the maze they had built around it. They unlocked their phone again. This time, however, they didn't reopen the long-saved message. They opened your contact, stared at your name, and began considering something much more direct. Keep your attention on what happens here, because the decision they made next was the first decision all afternoon that came without hesitation. They typed only 7 words: "Can we talk when you have time?" Then they stopped. No dramatic explanation. No pressure. No attempt to control what happened afterward. Your soulmate wanted to leave room for your choice because this afternoon had taught them something important: honesty doesn't require certainty about the response. It requires enough courage to communicate clearly and enough respect to let another person respond freely. Their thumb moved toward the screen, and this time they sent it. The message disappeared into the conversation, leaving behind that tiny indication that something had finally crossed the distance between intention and action. Your soulmate placed the phone down and exhaled. For the first time since the afternoon began, they weren't rewriting imaginary conversations in their head. They had done the only thing available to them: opened the door. And while they waited, another realization emerged. If you agreed to talk, they weren't going to overwhelm you with every thought they had experienced today. They would begin with the actual moment that triggered everything. They would tell you about the question someone asked, the unexpected answer they gave, and the realization that followed. Then they would listen. Really listen. Because perhaps you had your own version of this story: moments they misunderstood, silences you interpreted differently, things neither of you had known how to say. And if you've stayed with this unfolding story, you can share what this moment means to you in the comments, send the video to someone who might appreciate its message, and subscribe if you'd like to continue with us. Because while your soulmate was preparing for an honest conversation, their phone suddenly moved against the table. The screen illuminated, and your soulmate didn't reach for it immediately. For 2 seconds, they simply stared. After an entire afternoon spent reacting too quickly inside their own mind, they wanted to meet this moment differently. Then they picked up the phone. Your name was there. A response had arrived. Their expression softened as they opened it, and whatever they read made them sit down slowly. It wasn't a grand declaration, and that was exactly why it mattered. Your response had created space for the conversation they had been afraid might never happen. Your soulmate read it again, then glanced toward the saved message containing everything they had almost sent earlier. They knew now that those paragraphs had served their purpose even if you never saw them. Writing them had forced your soulmate to understand what they actually needed to say. So instead of copying those words into the conversation, they answered simply and began preparing themselves to speak without a script. But before that conversation could happen, they reopened one particular memory, the same memory that had resurfaced earlier, and noticed something they had somehow missed every previous time. A detail about your final words that day. Your soulmate whispered the sentence aloud, testing its meaning against everything they had learned this afternoon. Their eyes widened slightly. Because if they were interpreting those words correctly now, then the misunderstanding between you may have started much earlier than either of you realized. And suddenly, your soulmate knew the first question they needed to ask when the two of you finally spoke.